welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. On tonight's show, we discuss two reports which highlight the grave food insecurity caused by conflict and violence. In the first report, the UN World Food Programme has stated that for the first time since the civil war began in Yemen, the organization has accessed the rebel-held district of Nim and provided relief. With 20 million of the total Yemeni population of 29 million food insecure, is the survival of the war-torn people in this region fully reliant on aid? Later on the show, we also discuss UNICEF's report regarding Afghanistan, which claims that 2 million children suffer from malnutrition, and without external support, 600,000 children might face death. But first, let's begin from Yemen. Joining us for this discussion today is Bushra Nasar, who's an activist joining us from Sweden. We're also joined by Mr. Ruairi Casey, who's a journalist joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Ms. Bushra Nasar, let me begin with you. So I stated some figures here that out of the 29 million total population of Yemen, 20 million people are food insecure. Just elaborate on this and tell us what the significance of this figure is.
Yes, since the war erupted, 50% of the GDP or the exportation of the revenues of the country stopped, was in half. Now it's about 90%. Yemen rely on exporting food and goods about 90%. So since the war erupted and the besiege of the country, it was really difficult to access to food and continue the import for food, especially the foreign currency, the lack of the foreign currency in the country, and the difficulties for the ships to come into the ports of Hodeidah and Aden, and the infrastructure destruction also. All this escalated the problem and created a big famine problem in the country.
Right. And Ms. Nasser, you mentioned here before the war broke out how much Yemen relied on for food. Let's talk a little more about the conditions prior to the war. Yemen was still a country that was poor. Almost half the population lived under the poverty line. What has the conflict exacerbated? Highlight that for us.
Yes, the country was in a very difficult economic situation. That's why when the Spring Revolution took place, or the Arabic Spring took place, unfortunately, with the situation that the country was going through, we had about 30% of unemployment and huge amount of in poverty, but not reaching to the extent of famine. Not reaching to the extent of these pictures that we see here today about Yemen, the humanitarian situation. And then we have also the remittance from the Yemenis helped a lot during the war as well, and before that. And these remittance also declined over time, and because most of Yemenis have relatives in the neighboring Gulf countries who are working there, and these are rich countries, and that's helped to cope a little bit. But now, even with the remittance, it's getting less and less, and difficulties to access to food, etc.
Right.
This escalated the problems.
Right. And Mr. Ruairi, from what Ms. Nasser has just highlighted for us, what about organized funding for the Yemen conflict? Now, there was a conference in 2019, February 2019, which raised $2.6 billion out of the needed $4 billion for the conflict. Now, this aid that is being generated, do you think it's being delivered to Yemen?
Well, there's a lot of questions around the delivery of aid compared to the amount of money pledged. The money being delivered to Yemen in terms of humanitarian aid has increased year on year, but also the situation has deteriorated year on year, so the money needed has increased. And in no year in the last four of the conflict has the money coming in met the requirements of what various aid agencies have asked for. About a third of the aid going into Yemen now is specifically for food aid. The WFP, the World Food Programme, is the biggest beneficiary of any agency acting there. But they still need a lot more money. They've still been asking for a lot more money. And as well, there's questions over who is delivering the money. The two countries account for over half of the money, the humanitarian aid going into Yemen at the moment. And those two countries are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Now, those two countries are also parties to the war. They're leading the coalition against the Houthi rebels in the country.
In that instance as well, the UN official stated that while they will take the donations regardless of who is donating what on that side. That was their stance because it's evident that they desperately need the funds. But on that question of highlighting how many questions surround the actual delivery of the funds, it seems to be very difficult to verify that. The World Food Programme, which released a statement saying that they were able to access NIM for the first time at the end of May. We tried to reach out to them, but they were not in a position to respond to us. They said that the situation in Yemen is extremely complex and they refused to respond. And this raises a lot of questions because we sitting here, how do we know what's actually happening in Yemen if organizations who have access there are not responding to the situation?
Well, access is always what humanitarian workers in Yemen talk about, because it's very hard to get access to places like NIM. It's been 4 years, and it's not far outside Sana'a, but it still has been inaccessible. And the way they get, there's a whole patchwork of militias and of various armies that control various territories. So aid organizations have to negotiate access to these. So they have to toe a very careful line in making sure that they don't fall afoul of certain militias or whatever and end up getting held up at roadblocks or getting denied papers. So there is a constant, there's a very careful attitude that a lot of them take. Not always. I mean, even just last month, the WFP actually came out very strongly against the Houthis and at one point threatened to suspend aid to Houthi-controlled areas.
Right.
So it depends on the local situation.
Right. And just to speculate, since we weren't able to talk to them directly, on the 20th of May, they suspended the aid that was supposed to reach Yemen, and they talked about corruption. On the 31st of May, that aid was released. What do you think happened during that duration, and what do you think they mean when they say corruption?
I mean, all sides have been accused of misappropriating aids going into controlled areas. They've been accused of blocking it. The Houthis have come in for probably more criticism than others. Whether that reflects the reality on the ground, again, because if the Saudis and UAEs are donating money, there is a sense that agencies would be less likely to criticize them for the same deeds that the Houthis are committing. But it does seem that corruption at a very local level is a huge impediment to delivering aid. And that isn't something that I imagine a lot of agencies like to talk about to news channels. They have to do whatever they need to get access to areas and get aid to civilians.
Right.
And that's their priority.
Right. And Ms. Nasar, following that, there is obviously a goal, which is to provide relief to these areas. But there are many difficult questions that come when people talk about aid. What do you think are some of the angles that people should look at and some of the considerations needed by donors while they're talking about Yemen and talking about providing relief to this area?
Yes. Let me just continue where my colleague has stopped. Regarding corruption, it has been accused by the Yemenis CSOs and the Yemeni community since 2017. Many statements came out with corruption and confiscated aid, and they have been there was like some silence because these international NGOs work in a very difficult situation, they're very complex situations, and they have been asking for more transparency on aid release. And so until in December 2017, there was a release by the international humanitarian aid organizations that the denial and the condemning of the corruption and etc. And when David Beasley, the WFP director, since November, December, he has been announcing that there is something going on. I'm talking about 2018. That's a very brave statement. And though it was a bit late, but it's important. And by denying access for aid, it's an international criminal crime and war crime. And we knew about it for long. The Yemeni community knew about it for a long time, since the beginning of aid system, because aid, when aid works, it's not obliged to do any transparency, any financial reports, publishing his financial reports. Now there is a very big campaign in the country for like 3-4 months now. It's called Wayn al-Fulus. Where's the money? NGOs black hole in Yemen. So there is a big movement in the country for this issue. What we as Yemeni women, we have issued a letter, and this situation that the aid denial of aid, it's also putting a very important, focusing on a very important and a larger problem, which is crashing the civil society. In the northern part of Yemen, you cannot talk any longer. The civil society cannot talk about the word peace. They are closing.
Nasar, tell us, you're talking crushing of the civil society, the civil space to question and to raise your voices, and you're also talking about the movement that's gaining momentum. How do those work side by side in Yemen?
Usually this momentum is on Twitter by sending letters to the international NGOs, asking them to expose their financial reports. None of the international NGOs until today has reported their financial reports or responded to 6,000 letters that has been sent by the Yemeni community, and it is a very difficult situation. We as Yemeni women have been asking to use or harness technology in aid. First of all, aid should not stop. Yemen needs aid. Suspending aid is not the solution. Right. The solution is to cooperate, to put pressure on the Houthis, to cooperate, maybe move to Aden. These international NGOs headquarters move to Aden. Find another way to serve those people. You cannot just deny. They cannot just deny the humanitarian access and the suspension, and that's it. Right. There is a problem that should be solved.
Right. And Ms. Nasar, hold on to that thought while I ask Mr. Rory here from something that you mentioned, that so many of the Yemenis wrote letters to the NGOs requesting them to release their financial documents. Mr. Rory, what do you think is the reason behind none of these organizations responding or taking notice or taking action after such an overwhelming request came in for them to release their reports?
I mean, a lot of major NGOs have always been, they're major institutions, and they have this sort of governing logic within themselves, and they are not overly transparent. Organizations like the UN are not known to be extremely transparent in their uses of funding and so on. So I imagine it's a continuation of long-standing policy that they don't feel the need to change in this particular instance. I can certainly sympathize with Yemenis who want transparency, but I imagine what humanitarian organizations would say is we have to, guarantee access. We have to guarantee food going to these areas. Transparency can't be our number one concern, especially if it were to come into conflict with the delivery of that aid.
Right. And given the situation in Yemen, the extremely complex situation, the lack of access, the violence that's ongoing, the corruption scandals that are ongoing, given all of that, do you think that all these international organizations are doing enough, or do you think there's space to do more to provide relief?
I'm sure there is. It is an extremely difficult country. It's probably the most difficult country in the world to do what they're doing. And there has, I think maybe there's a lot, they certainly can be doing a lot better. They certainly should be more transparent, and they should be helping Yemeni civil society. But there is also a lack of real support from the international community for the work that these agencies are doing as well. This is a sort of era where a lot of states have kind of pulled away from funding humanitarian efforts generally, or have tailored it towards their own self-interest. You can think of Donald Trump.
And Mr. Rory, hold on to that very important point about how countries are pulling away from providing more humanitarian relief just generally, and what could be the causes behind that. I do want to talk about that a little more, but before that, we're joined by Dr. Anis Kassim, who's an international law expert joining us from Jordan. Thank you so much, Dr. Anis, for joining us. On the legality front and what is happening, what are the international conventions protecting aid relief? Give us a legal perspective on that. What international laws are violated when people are stopped from providing relief to those suffering from conflict?
As a matter of law, what is happening in Yemen, in the light of objective and the neutral international reports, prove and demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that there are war crimes committed in Yemen against civilians, which is in violation of international humanitarian law, meaning the Hague Convention of 1907 and the Geneva Convention of 1949. Obviously, the alliance airstrikes are targeting civilians and targeting civilian objects, residents, villages, caravans of school buses, and so forth. And these are now documented by UN reports.
Right.
And therefore, the alliance is to be held responsible for committing war crimes and the crimes against the humanity. Further, the massive destruction, which is disproportionate to the whatever objectives they have.
Dr. Anis, on that point here, I just want, for our viewers as well, before we proceed, just give them a perspective and give them a take on internationally for all conflicts. What are the protections given to relief workers and relief organizations that are supposed to just provide food, water, medical supplies? What is the protection given to them?
The Geneva Convention actually provides for such protection. The international law provides the humanitarian aid with lots of protection, including ambulances, medical support, food support. The attacking states actually, they should, under legal obligation, to allow assistance, food, medication to the civilian population. There is no doubt about it. And actually, there are many reports condemning the Israelis because of this.
Right.
It might as well condemn the alliance in attacking civilians and not allowing humanitarian aid to reach them.
Right. And Dr. Anis, you mentioned here that under legal obligation, they provide protection to these relief workers and to these relief initiatives. Now, what punishments or in what ways can these countries or these parties that prevent relief being given to civilians, how can they be punished or how can they be held accountable if there is any mechanism at all?
There is a mechanism which is to invoke the Security Council to invite the International Criminal Court to do the investigation and to bring to account those responsible for such atrocities. Of course, there are other ways that Yemen, for example, can plead with the prosecutor of the ICC in The Hague that there are crimes against civilians, war crimes are being committed against civilians in Yemen, and they are asking the prosecutor to designate investigation team to conduct the investigation to establish that. And by this should quell the alliance from going wild in bombing civilians and their villages.
Right. And
so there are two ways.
Right. And Dr. Anis, previously we were talking about organizations that are involved in providing relief and the transparency that surrounds them. Are there any international laws governing these NGOs that are working in other countries, providing relief, and who are being given funds and being given access? Are they under any obligation of the international law to be transparent in their procedures?
Well, it is not an obligation directly by international law related to the NGOs. It is, suppose we go to the International Criminal Court and we ask those NGOs to produce evidence that they have at their disposal, they are under obligation to produce such evidence. Otherwise, they would be accused of obstructing justice.
Right.
But you cannot hold them responsible directly for withholding such documents because they can claim that such documents are personal,
right,
or private. But if an international court compels them to produce such evidence, they are under obligation to do so.
All right. Thank you for that, Dr. Anis, shedding light on what the role of the international courts needs to be in this regard. Ms. Nasar, going back to you. Now, a UNICEF report stated that 8 children a day are killed as they are going about their systematic lifestyles, lack of systematic lifestyles in Yemen. Shed more light on the conditions of how people are attempting to proceed with their lives and what needs to be done by international organizations to restore a semblance of peace in this war-torn area.
Yeah, sure. First of all, the situation in Yemen is not to that exaggerating because there is food in the market. So what we are asking the international NGOs that they could let people purchase food, and this will help to create a little bit of economy in the market. Purchasing the food and facilitating for the traders to bring in the container to access to foreign currency. This is one problem. According to, we have been asking also to use harmless technology. According to my understanding, that the northern part or Houthi areas, controlled areas, they refuse to use the biometric system for distributing aid, and by this they don't want to be very collaborating with international NGOs. Until today, there are many other ways of accessing food to those people. According to the report from the panel of experts, the Security Council, UN Security Council panel of experts, they're saying that Hodeidah is no longer the main port for receiving the containers. 70% of the containers goes to Aden and Mukalla. So this is what we call that they could move on, and they have been already bringing food to these ports, and the coalition and the government, Yemeni government, should collaborate in efficiently functioning these ports and delivering these to the people. Bringing in economy back to the country, development to the country is another solution as well. Resilience programs are solutions. I just want to say something about the death of the children. It is true that there is every 10 minutes there is a child who dies in Yemen today, but there is a very important indicator that the researchers of the UNDP, I was sitting in a panel a month ago, the GNI coefficient, which is the difference between the rich and the poor in Yemen. In the northern part of Yemen, he said that it was 0.9, which is the highest. It's higher than the corruption in Africa. In Africa, it's 0.7 or 0.8. In Yemen, it's 0.9, which indicates there is a new wealth distribution by the rebels, by the Houthis, taking advantage of all this situation and this war going on.
Right. Right, and Ms. Nasar, we're short on time, but thank you for that perspective and thank you for joining us. Mr. Rory, just a last question to you, something that Ms. Nasar also pointed out here. In terms of relief work, both sides need to be on the same table, and they need to both work together to make sure that relief is given to those who are most in need of it. Do you see a future of that happening?
No, it really doesn't seem like both sides. It doesn't really seem like peace is anywhere close at hand, and it doesn't seem like the coalition is going to work with the Houthis in any way. They've really struggled to have any sort of peace talks. They've struggled over the maintaining peace in Hodeidah under the ceasefire agreement there. Most assessments, I think, have been pretty pessimistic as to how this is going to all be resolved. It's really descended into, militarily a real quagmire where no side has been able to have any sort of victory. So it seems like the situation is going to continue for the
Mr. Rory, you have definitely reiterated something that many experts and analysts talked, and they paint a bleak future for Yemen here. Thank you so much, Mr. Ruairi Casey, for joining us and talking to us. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we're going to discuss Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. With Afghanistan facing the worst drought in a decade, some 2/3 of the population currently do not have access to food and water, and an estimate of 2,600,000 people have been displaced. The situation for children in Afghanistan is naturally worse, with the threat of 600,000 children dying if immediate relief is not provided. Let's discuss this story further in detail. For this, we're joined by Mr. Emran Feroz, who's a journalist joining us from Germany. We're also joined by Mr. Phil Robertson, who's the Deputy Director of Human Rights Watch Asia, joining us from Bangkok. Thank you both for joining us. Mr. Feroz, let me begin with you. Now, what do you think in the current situation in Afghanistan is the main cause for the hunger crisis?
Well, thanks, first of all, for having me. I think the current crisis is just part of a global crisis we are facing, and we also see in Afghanistan that the country is not just haunted by war and conflict, but also by the change of the environment and all these issues. And this really increased a lot. You already mentioned the drought. And there are also glaciers on the mountains in Afghanistan that have been melted for the very first time in this year or during the last years. And that's, an effect of global warming and all these things. And especially in a poor country like Afghanistan, which is facing so many other problems, it's very difficult for the people to handle with it.
Right. Mr. Robertson, following Mr. Feroz stated that what is happening in Afghanistan is just a play out of a global phenomena. And a poor country would, of course, have more struggles in coping with the situation. But let's talk about what could have been done and what was not done. Now, let's talk about the reconstruction aid that was supposed to be given to Afghanistan for it to be able to cope with such disasters. Do you think that this aid was enough? And do you think in the past there was enough reconstruction done in Afghanistan for them to avoid this crisis?
Look, the biggest problem in Afghanistan is the issue of access for humanitarians, the ability to get assistance to the places it needs to go. Certainly, there is some degree of fatigue amongst international donors about Afghanistan, but the reality is that if both the government and the Taliban were prepared to allow for access to be provided to, for instance, these children facing malnutrition, to these other various communities that don't have food security, I think that the resources could be found to do that. With the reconstruction aid, that's all about getting things to the places there needs to go. I mean, this is about roads, this is about infrastructure, this is about basic parts of the infrastructure of Afghanistan that is critical to getting assistance to where it needs to go. When the biggest problem when we see in terms of humanitarian crises around the world, whether it be Yemen or Afghanistan, is war and the barriers that put in front of humanitarians wanting to do the right thing and making sure that food and medical assistance get to the most needy.
Expand upon those barriers that have been put in front of humanitarian workers and also those who just want to contribute to the humanitarian cause.
Well, we're looking at targeting of humanitarians. Every year, there are more humanitarians being killed in conflicts, being targeted by one side or the other. We see issues of basic security on the ground. In some cases, we see retaliation against people for seeking aid if the aid comes from a source that the political people in that area don't like. We've seen in places like Myanmar simply barring access to any areas while the Burmese military carries out crimes against humanity and genocide. So again, time after time, these are man-made disasters that are sometimes exacerbated by the climate disasters that we're talking about, the drought,
right,
the global warming. But the reality is that much of this is coming from warfare and from barriers to humanitarians getting to where they need to go.
Right. And Mr. Robertson, I've noted down that you made that what the main cause for it is, but I want to touch upon something that you mentioned earlier about the international fatigue amongst donors for donating. And for that, I'm going to redirect my question to Mr. Feroz. Mr. Feroz, now, U.S. aid for Afghanistan for the reconstruction has gone down. It's declined since 2018. Do you think that could be a reason for the issues that are playing out now and the lack of infrastructure in place to provide water in this country? Because this is not supposed to be a water scarce country. It just points out that the infrastructure is underdeveloped.
Yeah, well, to be honest, I don't think that too less money have been pushed into Afghanistan into the last years or even decades. Western, international donors pumped a lot of money into Afghanistan. But I think the main problem is that political elites in the country that are totally corrupt since they took over and have been installed by the West, large parts of them are just stealing the money. And this is something that we have to talk about. I mean, I visited a village near Kabul 2 months ago, and you could find nothing there. They had one water pump, and this water pump was donated by a private donor from Germany, who was an Afghan, who was originally from this village, and he just sent them this water pump as a gift from Germany. It was about 50 years old, and I think he found it at some market, and he thought, okay, let's send it to Afghanistan because people might need it there. I think, if you face things like that, you're just shocked because you see that, it's obvious that you have to ask yourself why do you find such a situation if you visit a village which is just, 20 minutes far away from Kabul city, and then you ask yourself, where are all the billions of dollars that have been invested into this country? So I don't think that too less money have been a problem here.
Right.
It's just about the fact that the wrong people received it, and this is taking place until today.
Right. And Mr. Feroz, from your experience and your interaction with people on ground from the locals, what did you gather about the situation there in terms of hunger and water scarcity?
Most of these people feel totally helpless. They say, listen, nobody's helping us. The government does not care about us. The Taliban do not care too. We have to care for ourselves, and this is just very difficult because actually we don't have, or we almost have nothing. And often it's a very desperate situation, and it's already, as Mr. Robertson also stated, very few observers and humanitarians and such persons are, it's difficult for visiting these places. It's difficult for them to visit these places, and it's just making the whole situation more desperate.
Right. And Mr. Robertson, talking about difficulty in reaching these places, can you talk more about are there any solutions that can come out of these difficult situations in terms of being able to make sure the funds, the relief aid goes to the right people? Are there any tangible ways to make sure that happens?
Well, this is all about monitoring of where the aid goes. This is a central part of international development assistance. And the problem is, of course, that the government often places barriers to that. They say you have to give it here. If you don't provide it in the way we want it, we won't take it. And humanitarians want to provide the assistance. They want to provide the aid. Sometimes they argue that, well, even if 50% gets stolen, 50% gets through. The problem is, as your other guest has mentioned, that there's a lack of political will to ensure that development assistance reaches the most needy. And we don't see this just in Afghanistan, but we see this in countries around the world where there's conflicts. That elites are taking advantage of the access to resources provided by the international community, the development assistance and others, and taking kickbacks or skimming money off the top. This is, it's a horrible situation. It's ethically challenged. These are people who are literally taking money out of starving children's mouths, and they need to be called account to that. The problem is that the international development sort of industry is all about making sure that the taps keep flowing, that things keep moving, that assistance is provided. And I think what has happened now is the political priority has moved away from Afghanistan to other countries, for instance, Yemen or others, and that's where the donors are now providing more assistance. And Afghanistan has become a whole lot less glamorous, become seen as an intractable problem where no matter how much money is provided, there will be nothing that will come of it. And that is a very bad, sad situation. It's a sort of indication that people have agreed to give up. And right. I think that the international community can't do that to the women and children and other vulnerable people in Afghanistan.
Right. And Mr. Feroz, Mr. Robertson highlighted this issue here, that the glamorization associated with Afghanistan is diminishing. And that is, of course, causing people to lose interest in the conflict and interest in the lives of the people there. How do you think the narrative regarding Afghanistan needs to change?
Well, I think also that it's difficult. It has become difficult because people have become somehow tired of Afghanistan. And, this is an ongoing conflict for almost 40 years now. We are not just talking from 2001 on, but also about the civil war, which took place in the 90s, and the war against the Soviets, which took place in the 1980s. And it's right, people are just tired of it. They cannot hear of it. And it's also the case for international donors who are focusing on countries like Yemen. But right. We just have to continue to challenge them, I think, and we just have to point out that the situation in this country should not be forgotten. Afghanistan must not be forgotten again. And that's why I think constant coverage of this issue is very important. And, we
and
just
do you
have
think
to force
the international media does justice to the coverage of Afghanistan and the situations that are existing there right now? Because we seldom hear about the drought and the humanitarian crisis ongoing. We hear more about the violence and the political front of it all.
Yeah, if we talk about the international media, it's sometimes a bit difficult. I think there are some media outlets who try to portray a different picture of Afghanistan who try to point out different problems inside the country.
Right.
But of course, there are also a lot of outlets who do not really care or who do not have the resources to focus the whole time on one country.
Right. And since we're running short on time, Mr. Roberts, I'm going to put my last question very quickly to you. Give us a sense of how grave the international hunger crisis is, especially for conflict zones.
Well, I think it's an ongoing problem that is compounded by the human rights violations that's connected to warfare. The fact that food is being used as a weapon in many conflicts. By depriving people of food, they are trying to make an insurgent group or a group that is in a particular area give up, and using this weaponization of food and actual provision of supplies, or the denial of that, as a weapon in conflict. And that is a fundamental problem that I think needs to be addressed.
Right. And thank you so much, Mr. Philson, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you, Mr. Emran Feroz, for joining us and talking to us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.